Warning. The following broadcast is not approved by your teacher, university, politician, or government. Side effects may include skepticism, better reasoning skills, liberty, peace, and an escape from the woke.
Welcome to the show. I am your host, LB Muniz, and this is episode 100 of the Been Awake podcast for better sense. We go live. I don't fall asleep in the hotel. We go live every Tuesday and Wednesday in X Spaces. So I hope you join me there. What a slow start to episode 100. All right. Let's jump into tonight's episode. Do me a favor, if you before we do that, get the housekeeping out of the way. If this is your first time listening, do me a favor, go to the LB Muniz on X, follow me there. If you want emails, you can go to beenawake.com, subscribe there, and you'll get emails of everything that I do, including notifications about these live streams with links to where you can listen live or, of course, catch the replay. This show goes on to all your standard podcatchers after we record it. So, wow, episode 100. Didn't think I'd make it here at times, but we keep plodding along. You know, like there's this, I've heard a number of times that like if a podcast makes it past like 10, like most podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. I don't know if that's the case anymore. And I don't know how that also coincides with live stream, but hey, it's kind of cool that I hit this number. And I am not going to spend too much time talking about that. But thanks for listening live or to the recording, and looking forward to many more episodes of better sense making for you. And that is a little bit of what tonight's monologue is about. If you're in there and you want to talk later, I definitely would love to hear bouncing back of ideas or something like that. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about limit, in a philosophical sense of that word. We're going to be kind of analyzing it at an ideas level. I do like to cover current events and things like that on this show. And I think that's an important way for us to engage with the world around us, for better or for worse. But it's still important if we want to be aware of what's going on around us. But I also, if you've listened to the show for any point in time, you would know I also have a deep love of philosophy and philosophical inquiry. And one of the things that I think people have gotten upset with as it relates to philosophical inquiry, or even like something a little more mundane like debate, is that it's like it doesn't really go anywhere and it doesn't turn into anything. Maybe we can talk a little bit about why I think that is. I think people are kind of realizing that things need to change, and so when people are just talking about ideas, it's difficult for them to understand why we're going to talk about the same ideas over and over again. However, up and until something dramatically shifts, it's one of the only tools we have to make sense of the world around us. Everything, as they say, has a time and a place. And that's certainly something that I do, and I think there's a very good reason for it. So let's kind of start, and you'll begin to see why. One of the earliest words uttered on this podcast and on the pages of beenawake.com were the name of this space, Been Awake, is an answer to the inevitable question, why aren't you one of us? And my answer is because I searched for the same answers and I found a better path to understanding. This is to say, I'm not woke, I've been awake. Now, I started this in 2020. I think the first post went out early September of 2020, which was when the world had changed. And this word woke had kind of been bouncing around. Now, you might notice if you've listened to recent episodes, we don't spend too much time on it, that word in particular, because it's kind of gotten out of vogue, but it doesn't change that basic understanding of part of the reason why I chose to do this is because people weren't giving the right answers. And so I felt like there were some better answers to give. Now, the next line is the more important one for the purposes of our conversation. And I've said this many a time. Categorization is a useful tool, but unlike rocks and plants, human ideas are not so easily separated from one another. We are beings of language and recognizing differences between things. We have to be. That's one of the reasons why our language capacity is so developed, is because is because we can. And on top of that, we can talk about not only the physical world, but we can talk about symbology, ideas, abstract concepts. I dealt with this a couple episodes ago. You can go back and listen. Human ideas are not so easily separatable, right? Everything kind of blends together, and you can easily, frankly, the reality is, if you do enough study in the world of ideas, you realize you can pretty easily break things apart and reconfigure them in a way that suits a pre-existing narrative that you have and that you believe in. There are many concepts that we talk about on the show. Some come to us from the culture, and some are produced from this project, the project of better sense making. Producing concepts was a gap I saw in the media landscape. So much of politics and political discourse is driven by ideology, right? So part of engaging in the political conversation that we inevitably engage in our modern day is a consequence of saying that we have a set of ideas that we think would better govern the world, or in turn that we are advocating for the current set of ideas that govern the world, as the case may be. It's all ideological. And so most of the people that we listen to, myself included, all of us included, are ideologically driven people. Now, that ideology could be a commitment to the truth, and that's kind of a good thing, depending most of the time. But it's still ideological many a time. There are very few people who will dedicate time onto how ideologies form and the tactics they deploy. So sketching out the edges of various ideologies and concepts present in our society and culture is a large part of what I tried to do here. By doing so, I think we can begin to recognize the tactics used to advance ideological power, and in turn support it or defend it, if it's what we like or what we don't like. Recently, I was asked by a friend how I contend with the notion of thinking for yourself. And we were talking about what I think is a very common thing for us to feel and experience, especially those of us who are interested in exploring ideas, which is, as you dive in, as you immerse yourself into one form of thinking versus another, you can find yourself lost amidst the rhetorical arguments of one person versus another. After all, we're mimetic creatures, and as I'm fond of saying, monkey see, monkey do. I think, to put it simply, the notion of thinking for yourself, like everything else, has a limit. And not for nothing, a lot of what the early forms of thinking for yourself, as the case may be, might look like actually is mimicry. You are actually copying somebody, almost exactly in some cases. And there's nothing wrong with this. And in fact, when we were having this conversation, we were kind of going back and forth. And I think some of it, like the word itself is often used in like, you got to think for yourself, man. So really, it's not saying that you're going to think for yourself. It's that saying you shouldn't think like everybody else. Recognizing that there's a limit to ideas, there's a limit to our existence, is a fundamental guard against chaotic thinking. And I think good philosophy, trust me, there's a lot of chaotic philosophers out there, right? Now, there's maybe a case to be made that we need to put stuff into historical context, but we're not going to be doing that in this one. And I'll get into why in a second. One of the problems that we face in the West is that chaotic thinking has found its way to the heart and seat and power of many institutions, including the government, including major press outlets, including Hollywood, including all these places that invariably affect our lives. In the future, many a historian will posit when precisely this sort of thing began, when precisely the chaotic thinking started to take hold and take root at the center of society. And many do so today. Some people will say it's 2008, others when Trump was elected in 2016. Some will say it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union or when the Twin Towers fell and the terror wars began, maybe when the atom bomb was dropped, or when Woodrow Wilson decided to make the world safe for democracy, or maybe when Abraham Lincoln decided that the states couldn't leave the Union. Maybe people will say that the American Revolution itself was an entrance of this chaotic thinking. And some people, too, will even say it's the Enlightenment or the introduction of postmodernism. All of them are right to various degrees. And depending on when we want to start that clock, which is something I'm very fond of doing, deciding when we're going to start the clock, we can build a narrative around that, a historical narrative that gives us that helps us understand what's going on. But here's the problem with that. Most people aren't willing to learn a different historical narrative. It's a basic idea of the allocation of resources. Why would you spend so much time thinking about something that you don't believe affects your life, and in some respects doesn't? So I want to, and I'll get into why. I want to remove the strictures of historical analysis and free ourselves from its minutia. Part of the complicated nature of the task lends itself, the complicated nature of the task of historical understanding history lends itself to many offshoots that cloud our judgments. How many times have you engaged in a conversation or witnessed one on a various media platform that devolved because somebody was able to bring up an obscure point that really didn't have anything to do with the other guy's point, but still needed to be addressed? We are not omnipotent beings. We do not have the luxury of standing above creation. Rather, we are thrown into the midst of it. The decisions of those long dead have always guided the actions of the people now living. This is not new. But because of our access to information, we sometimes, I think, we lose grasp and we lose hold of the fact that many humans have accomplished great things throughout history without fully ever understanding how we got here. Large philosophical questions such as these deserve their place, but that place can't be the center. What it does is support the center, or at least it's supposed to. However, we can take these long diversions and make them simple. That's what a concept is. So that's kind of what I'm doing here tonight. Part of what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to spend a long time talking about something that I can summarize in a few words: the cult of American democracy. That's what a concept gives us. And to the extent that we can use that mimetically, rhetorically, we can start to understand the world better around us. Concepts that we use in modern day are concepts like democracy, making the world safe for it, freedom, liberty, equality, safety. These are very simple words that actually hold a lot of meaning behind them that we take for granted. Because we as humans are thrown into the midst of history, we don't have the benefit of starting it. This is what concepts give us. And by recognizing their limits, we begin to form a better picture of the world. Without limit, we can never understand how to properly navigate the world, because understanding limit allows us to take our frame of reference and make decisions that propel us forward. This has always been what humans have done. Without limit, you cannot have order. Without order, you cannot fight against chaos. So with any complicated social, political, or cultural trend, I think we should first look for the limits to gain a better picture. So let's return for a moment to the question of whether you can think for yourself. At a very fundamental level, we can't accomplish this, at least in the context that it's often applied. To understand this, let's take the common aphorism, thinking outside the box. This is supposed to convey a desire to find and innovate a solution to a given problem. However, in doing so, we invariably create another box, another system to operate within. Sometimes this may work, other times it will fail. But in all cases, we never actually think outside the box. We merely find another box to think in, or in very rare cases, we might build a box for others to think in. Recognizing our limitation does not remove meaning from life or make the journey any less fascinating. It also doesn't mean that everything is predetermined, but it certainly demonstrates how not all things are possible. The notion that anything that any one thing is possible, is something that we should fight against. This sort of hubris, that the sort of hubris that carries this way of thinking, has led to the ruin of many before us and will continue to do so. So we recognize then that everything has a limit. Great. How do we apply this to modern problems? To restate, when we recognize limits, we begin to see incentives. Incentives give us decisions to make, and weighing these decisions is the task in front of everyone. You could also call, in economic terms, we would call this trade-offs. Sometimes a decision is made and it benefits a neighborhood or a family. Sometimes a decision is made and countries go to war and millions die. The mechanics are there to be seen by those who choose to. This is, in some respects, philosophy is a scientific endeavor after all. Quite literally, right? A PhD is a philosophy is a doctorate in philosophy of just various fields, right? So you can get a doctorate of philosophy in philosophy, or doctor of philosophy in philosophy, or doctor of philosophy in history, whatever. Point is, in the past, we didn't live in a world that was so bifurcated. And ironically, I know I just said it's a scientific endeavor. Part of that balkanization and bifurcation of ideas into all these various fields is a consequence of scientific thinking being put at the center. Again, that is not the center, but it supports the center. Science is the scientific process as we understand it, hypothesis, testing a hypothesis, recording results, and then trying to replicate it. I know I'm missing something. Hypothesis, create an experiment, whatever. But science is also just understand. If we understand and we notice patterns, that's also science of a kind. And specifically, as we deal with the abstract, that's the only science we can really have at our disposal. So any school of thought that posits that only science is empirical is wrong is wrong in a fundamental way. So talking about those mechanics, I want to put forth a concept I've discussed it many times. The cult of American democracy will break down the constituent parts of the words and put them back together, and hopefully we begin to see an outline a little bit better. So the word cult, right? I use the word cult oftentimes in a descriptive sense. I understand that most of the time it has a negative or pejorative sense to that word. A cult is any group of people, put simply, right? There's a reason why cult and culture have like the same root. If we go back to the time of the ancients, there were various cults that were dedicated to various forms of the pantheon of gods. So it wasn't just that you worshipped Zeus, let's say, but you worshipped Zeus the conqueror, or you worshipped Zeus the king of the marketplace, or something to that effect. So it was a specific dedication you had inside of a larger set of ideas that in turn could be inside of a larger set of ideas. So what we can understand by using this word, is that we're limiting ourselves a couple of times inside of larger ideas. Again, these are all things that we have to take for granted in order to, these are things that we all take for granted when we use words like Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Socialists, Social Democrats, Communists. Oh gosh, what else do we say? Anarchists. All of these words are predicated upon other words. And I know like some people are probably listening to this, or, might be listening to this like, yeah, dude, you're not really saying much. I'm not. I'm building. We're building up. And so that's what I was saying before, is sometimes philosophical analysis is the process of training you to think. So I'm not asking you to think for yourself. What I'm asking right now is for you to take a back seat in a stranger's mind. So ideas have lifespans, so to speak, beyond a particular cult. Cults are therefore more temporal. They are more limited to the realm of time. They are also normal and a part of our being as creatures. Cults are also prone to decay, and to the extent that they rely on something perennial, they will survive, perhaps into new forms, but they will survive nonetheless. So we're not worried about the or of. The next word would be American. So the use of America is, again, another limiter. What I'm trying to do is refine our understanding so that we can actually gain a sense of the outlines of a thing in the world of ideas. We could talk about democracy or existence or happiness, all those things. In fact, I kind of want to a little bit more on the show. But then from that abstraction, we have to limit and ground ourselves in order to have any sort of understanding. Otherwise, we're just, I don't know, intellectually masturbating or something like that. So this is a limiter. For example, I could just talk about the cult of democracy, but I'm talking about the cult of American democracy to make it precise. By doing so, we bind ourselves to something from the more immediate past. So to a certain extent, we're going to kind of not worry about whether the Enlightenment was the ultimate failure. We can walk that path another time, but for the very least, we're going to understand that this thing right now, this American thing, is what we're concerned with. This America of what? What is America? Right? Is it the people? Is it just the people who happen to live here now? Is it the people who lived here over 200 years ago? Is it America, the propositional nation? America, the nation of the people who were born here? Nation of immigrants, the great melting pot, founded in rebellion? All of these ideas are held within the concept of what America is. So then we turn to the word democracy. What is democracy? Right, again, democracy is democracy. Rule, archos, demo, many. The rule by many. That is the ostensible, that is the form of the word itself. So the idea is that the many will rule, that the many are the ones who ultimately hold power and sovereignty unto themselves. That doesn't mean that democracy itself is actually effective or even exists. You know, a lot of people will criticize the individualist frame, and I think there's certainly some limitations to it. But one thing that, at least in that Mises talked about, the methodological individualism, is understanding that individuals are the ones who act. And I don't think that's wrong. I think perhaps what it does is that if you only let yourself think like that, what you then forget is that there are things that then influence individuals to act. And those ideological forces are sort of what I'm more interested in than the fact that an individual acts. But if you've never thought about the fact that only an individual can act in the world, you wouldn't properly understand the application of the ideas. So, like, you could think of it as like ripples in a pond, right? If I throw a small stone, it'll send out little ripples, but if I throw a big rock, it's going to send out like little waves on the surface of the water. I also think you can think of ideas like that. You can also think of ideas as planets, at least in that we understand it with them having a gravitational pull. And this concept of gravity as pulling thing to its center is based off mass. And so the larger an idea is, and that can be measured, and that's measured twofold, both by the number of adherents, but also by their proximity to another gravitational center. We might see this is, again, the edges get fuzzy when we're talking about ideas, because you could then say, well, then there's this other level of gravitational pull that might be an institution, and those institutions are instantiations of ideas that live within a society that people inhabit. But what the people believe doesn't have to be what the elites believe. After all, the pharaohs were thought to be gods. Did some of those pharaohs believe themselves to be gods? Probably. But did they all die? Yes. There are some who will say that democracy itself is a problematic form of governance, that it was always subject to this sort of problem and decay that we see. I don't know that I completely believe that, but I think it has some credence as a level of criticism. I tend to operate more from a school that says that these things go through cycles. So when a democracy fails, something will take its place resembling a monarchical form of government, let's say. And democracies tend to crumble into monarchies, and monarchies tend to dissolve into democracies. Am I oversimplifying? Perhaps. But I think there's a cycle to the form that government takes that ideas exist outside of, to an extent. They have influence over, but they exist outside of. But Democracy, in that we're using it in the terms of the cult of American democracy, points to a specific form. It is this unfettered mass democracy that every person on earth deserves to have. It is the belief that this is the only way to look at the world and that anything else is abhorrent and needs to be stamped out. It is the diffusion of power and responsibility across so many people that no one person can be said to hold the blame. And that itself perpetuates itself in a system that invariably leads to more and more chaotic ends. And this softer tyranny also makes people more comfortable. Another form of the cult of democracy is that it operates along two equal tracks. The vacillation between these has created the stability it has achieved. The two equal tracks. So again, in popular terms, these are the Republicans and the Democrats. Right? That's what makes the cult of American democracy so strong, is that you have an outlet for two different ways of thinking. And both ways of thinking that you're allowed to have still perpetuate the system that was set up. This system is one predicated around progress, which means we always must be looking for a new frontier to move the culture, and to an extent, a rejection of tradition. Now, I know many conservative-minded people out there will hear that and think, that's a lie. I care about tradition. After all, I'm a conservative. But of course, the actual root word of conservatism isn't tradition, is it? It's about conserving. So what are you conserving? What are you conserving at this point, conservatives? Nothing. You're conserving a system that doesn't exist. You rely upon ideas of 200 years ago to try and animate you today, when nobody in power actually cares about those things. And so too for the other side. You are a good, you're a good lib. You're a good liberal. You think that the people at the bottom and to the margins, the bottom of society, should be cared for. You think that benevolence should be had and that people shouldn't be too greedy. How's that working out for either side? It's not, is it? The fact is, there are more homeless people. Homeless problem has gotten really bad across this country. Heck, we know that most people don't have $1,000. Even people who have a place to live ostensibly don't have $1,000 to rub together if something bad happens. Most people live paycheck to paycheck. How is that in accordance with liberal values? With the idea of taking care of your neighbor or taking care of the person who's less fortunate than you? How does the concept of conservatism have anything to do with waging war on a global scale, destroying buildings and and other societies, and also taking away your money to be used to make those things? Oh, and you're doing all of this when your streets have potholes and you don't know if your car is going to get broken into at night. Nothing's working because you've been fed a system of belief, this cult of American democracy, from people on high. And none of this is going to get better until people start to see this limit and figure out a way around it and through it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And no, apparently that's not going through the mixer. So, the outro music's playing right now. Love you guys. Go follow me on X.
If you like what you heard today, go to beenawake.com to subscribe for future updates. My name is LB Muniz, and I am not one with the woke.